But even frequent flyers packed into the belly of a 400-ton metal bird don't really understand how it works.
Rear propulsion and some airlift, and
I'm pre-med, so you think that after all the physics classes I would know something, but
I know it has to do with the wing design.
The gust of air shooting up, I guess. The wind, I think, or coming down. I'm not sure which way.
I would just assume random air currents. I really don't know.
I think the plane goes fast enough to get enough air through the engine.
Propellers make it go up and down.
Jets.
I can't remember. The wing is fatter at the front and it streamlines out.
The air lifts it.
The air's always important. It's pretty impressive it all works.
Every time I get up there, I think, how in the world is this happening?
He's not the only one.
Okay, so let's hope that the last guy was not the pilot.
Was killed and more than 100 hurt yesterday when a United Airlines jet traveling from Japan to Hawaii suddenly took a big dive. 11 of those injured are still in the hospital tonight. Correspondent Bob Orr reports. United Airlines Flight 826 was cruising 6 miles above the dark Pacific when the bottom fell out. This home video, taken just seconds after the Boeing 747 was jolted by turbulence, shows people with head injuries, dangling oxygen masks, luggage, food trays, and seat cushions strewn about the cabin. The jumbo jet, with 393 people on board, was nearly a third of the way from Tokyo to Honolulu. At about 33,000 feet, without warning, the plane hit a pocket of turbulence so severe, it plunged 1,000 feet in a matter of seconds. Unbuckled passengers and flight attendants who were in the process of serving dinner were slammed headfirst into overhead luggage bins. I went through the ceiling, said this battered passenger. I was panicked, said another. People were crying everywhere. The jetliner, with 100 injured, a dozen seriously, turned back to Tokyo. Dazed and heavily bandaged passengers walked off the plane. Others were carried, and paramedics worked feverishly, but without success, to revive one Japanese woman who died of head injuries. While turbulence is a common occurrence, deaths and serious injuries are rare. Since 1981, major U.S. airlines have reported 252 incidents of severe turbulence. More than 800 people have been hurt, but only 63 of them seriously. And including last night's fatality, only 3 deaths. Virtually all of the injured and killed were not wearing seatbelts. Veteran pilot Rick Husted says too many...
Okay, so we've seen this case a number of times, obviously. We know why the airplane ended up falling faster than the passengers inside, because it's being pushed down. It's being pushed down by forces generated inside the air terminal. People inside, however, are falling under the influence of gravity, and the airplane is falling faster because it's being pushed down. So the question is this: what's pushing the airplane in the downward direction at a rate larger than the gravitational pull? All right, so that's one of the things that will
CTDs, as they are called, were first developed after World War II by the Air Force to test ejection seats, or, as in this footage, for pressurized cabin tests.
If a portion of the airplane goes missing, you'll get sucked out. So for whatever reason, if the door opens up or the window just pops out, you will get sucked out of the airplane. So the question is why? You're thinking, oh, I know the answer because the inside is pressurized, right? So as a result, there's a huge pressure difference between inside and outside. Well, that's partially correct. That's not the entire reason. All right, so what causes the additional pressure difference that sucks you out of the airplane if a portion of the airplane goes missing? So that's one of the other things that we will get to
Well, former race car driver Mario Andretti involved in a really dramatic crash while testing a car at Indianapolis Motor Speedway Wednesday. Andretti going over 200 miles an hour. When he hit debris on the track, he walked away from this wreckage, but did get checked out at the track's hospital. He is unhurt. Andretti, 63 years old, retired from racing, but he was helping his son Michael out by testing out a car for his racing team. And Mike, he talked to reporters afterwards, said he was fine, but it was a wild experience. He didn't want anyone to think because of his age that it might have had anything to do with it. He said there was just no time to react, no yellow light, that nobody could have done anything about it, but he landed right side up, so it really made a big difference.
Yeah, like he said, he hit a solid chunk of debris going, what, 225? That's what Indy cars were qualifying, so he still got it.
So for the first time in 9 years, he's back in the car, and that's what happens. But he made it back in.
Yeah.
Well, former race car driver Mark.
This one is funny. So it's a debris, and the car becomes airborne. Why did it become airborne upon hitting a debris? He got lucky. It ended up landing right side up, obviously, so that's a good thing. Why did it become airborne? So something about the race cars. Did you guys know that you can drive these things upside down on a ceiling? If you're moving near full speed, you can actually, it's in theory, you should be able to drive them upside down on a ceiling. I'm surprised none of the James Bond movies started out with a scene like that. This is a James Bond worthy scene. You were driving into your tunnel and then just go up against traffic, and then you just climb up the ceiling from the side and then keep driving upside down. That you could do with these cars. So the question is, how's that possible? You'll find out. Speaking of race cars, this one is not going to play, but let's focus on this one.
As Ayrton Senna crossed the line.
Let's talk about Ayrton Senna. Those of you guys who don't know, Ayrton Senna was like, it was almost like Michael Jordan of
To
driving.
start the 7th lap of the San Marino Grand Prix, he was in pursuit of his 4th world title. As so often was the case, he was in the lead, traveling at 190 miles per hour. A computer on board his Williams FW16 registered the start of a new lap and began to record the 12.8 seconds of data that would tell the story of how Ayrton Senna died.
All right, so on that turn, he ended up losing traction. And then the car simply skidded out of control. And there was an accident, and there was something else that happened that killed him. So we will focus on that one. All right, so among other questions that I have, this one is probably the least imaginative, the least interesting, and possibly the most important question. All right, this question is going to play a major role in terms of developing the technologies that we use in jet engines as well as rockets. Notice that as the water is running down, it gets thinner. Why? Because the water is running down away from a faucet, it's running down from a faucet away from a faucet, it's getting thinner. So the question is why. All right, so we got a partially closed hose, the water is running through it speeds up. So the question is, why does the water speed up as it's exiting a partially closed hose? A lot of you guys are thinking, oh, because it increases the pressure. That's not the reason why. So if that's the case, what's the main reason? The main reason is the following. This is known as the constancy of the mass flow rate. What's happening is you got this contraption, bottleneck contraption. So this is the amount of fluid which is going to be squeezed into a smaller opening. So the volume of the fluid that enters has to be the same as the volume of the fluid that's going to exit the contraption. So what's happening is when you squeeze the fluid into a smaller opening, it's going to speed up. I said this is an incompressible fluid. This is the density of the fluid. And then obviously this is the cross-sectional area. This is the speed. So when you force it into a smaller area, what's going to happen is it's simply going to speed up because the volume of the fluid that enters into the contraption will be the same as the volume of the fluid that's going to leave the contraption, which is known as the constancy of the mass flow rate. The volume that enters is the same as the volume that leaves. All right, so the density of the fluid times the speed times the cross-sectional area is going to remain constant, which is known as the constancy of the mass flow rate. This somehow represents the volume of the fluid within the contraption. All right, so the initial volume of the moving fluid is going to be the same as the final volume of the moving fluid. They will be the same. So what that means is, for a given density, if you increase the area, speed is going to go down. If you reduce the area, speed is going to go up. If this is constant, if you reduce the area of the contraption, fluid is going to speed up. If you increase the area of the contraption, the fluid is going to slow down. All right, so if you force the fluid into a smaller opening, it's going to speed up. If you force the fluid into a bigger opening, it's going to slow down. All right, so this is known as the constancy of the mass flow rate. All right, so if this is like the jet engine, the action force is going to be acting on the fluid, the reaction force is going to be acting on the jet engine.
The blast of hot gases out of the end of a metal tube, one of the simplest ideas for an engine in history. Any child who's ever blown up a balloon, then released it to zoom through the air as it deflates, has seen how jet power works. The most common form of jet engine today is the turbojet. It uses spinning compressor wheels at the front end of the engine to compress the incoming.
All right, guys, the fluid is anything that flows. All right, air is a fluid, for example. Water is a fluid. Pepsi is a fluid. Coke is a fluid. Anything that flows.
Air.
And notice that you got the air, you compress the air into a small opening. So when you force the air into a small opening, it's going to speed up.
The air is then mixed with fuel and ignited.
All right, so by igniting it, what they're doing is they're increasing the density.
The blast of exhaust
It gets hotter.
gases out the back.
All right, so
Propels the engine forward, as well as rotating.
and then you push the air in the forward direction into a small opening, so it's going to speed up, which means that the air is accelerating, which means that there's a force acting on it. And so, which means that the reaction force is going to act on the jet engine.
Turbine wheels at the back, which turn the front compressor wheels on the same shaft. The main difference between the two is that the jet engine uses oxygen in the air for its combustion, while the rocket carries oxygen on board for its combustion. That makes the rocket engine heavy.
All right, so the rockets are exactly the same as the jet engines. In essence, once again, you got this bottleneck-shaped contraption known as a nozzle. So you force the fluid into a smaller opening. As a result, it's going to speed up, right? And so it's accelerating, meaning that there's a force acting on it, and the reaction force is going to act back on the rocket.
But allows it to operate outside the Earth's atmosphere.
All right, so the water running away from the faucet, notice that it's getting thinner, right? The question is why? Well, it's getting thinner because of the constancy of the mass flow rate. Water tension is going to keep the water together. It's just accelerating under the influence of gravity. So as it's speeding up, the cross-sectional area gets thinner. In essence, it gets smaller. All right, so that's the constancy of the mass flow rate. All right, we're not going to problem, so let's move forward. All right, guys, pick up the best answer. Put it in the chat. All right, so the theory that made it possible to build jet engines is the constancy of the mass flow rate. So you guys got that? Give us 5 points for that one.
But people were still convinced they could fly under their own power. Some harnessed the motive power produced by the bicycle, but the result was still the same. This was even though some of the machines were remarkably elaborate. Others thought that the secret lay in having sufficient initial height. One man went to the ultimate by using the top of the Eiffel Tower in what could only be supposed was literally a flying suit. But what seemed imaginative in concept proved fatal in practice. But the start of World War I put an end to such frivolous pursuits as human-powered flight. The paddle concept was an interesting one. But in practice, this was a goose doomed never to fly. The bicycle still provided the most likely means of achieving liftoff, but this man gave himself the added burden of having to use his arms to flap his wings. But it was a good muscle toner. This racing cyclist, however, did manage to get off the ground, albeit very briefly. But a controlled landing proved difficult. In the United States, Madame Albertine was certain that she could fly, given enough practice and faith. But the power of the mind was not enough to get herself or her students airborne. Yet perhaps it would work if sufficient takeoff speed could be achieved. Or maybe ski power would do the trick. Or, as this British birdman reckoned, why not use the power of the internal combustion engine for an assisted takeoff? But things did not work out as planned.
All right, so these people are trying to generate lift, despite the fact that the physics behind it has been known for hundreds of years. It goes back to this guy. His name is Daniel Bernoulli. All right, Daniel Bernoulli actually came up with a way to generate lift, and what he did is related to this contraption that we're looking at. Notice that as the fluid is exiting the contraption right here, it's speeding up, right? So when you force the fluid into a small opening, it's simply going to speed up. This one is speeding up. So he was more interested in the amount of pressure that this exiting fluid was going to generate at the exit point. A lot of you guys are thinking, oh, I think I know the answer. It's going to generate more pressure. Once again, if that's the way you're thinking, you're wrong. It's not going to generate more pressure. In fact, the exiting fluid is going to generate a smaller pressure at the exit point. So why? You're thinking, because the faster moving fluid in this direction is not going to be able to generate too much of a force in a direction which is 90 degrees to its motion. All right, so which means that it's not going to generate a lot of force on the boundary. This thing is moving really fast in this direction. It doesn't have a lot of motion, sideways motion towards the boundary. So it's not going to be able to generate enough force, which means that it's not going to be able to generate a lot of pressure on the boundary. So faster the fluid moves, follow the direction of motion. smaller the pressure it's going to generate along the direction which is 90 degrees to its motion. So which means that the force, which means that the pressure, exit pressure, is going to be smaller than the entry pressure that you're looking at. So which means that the faster moving fluid is going to generate a smaller amount of pressure than the slower moving fluid, in essence. So faster the fluid moves, the smaller the pressure is going to be, which means that the smaller the amount of force that it's going to apply on the boundary as it's exiting. Slower the fluid moves, the larger the pressure is going to be. All right, so he came up with a mathematical model representing this. It looks like this. You don't need to know the details of it. The only thing you need to know is the relationship between the speed and the pressure. So the faster moving fluid is going to generate a smaller pressure. So faster fluid moves, smaller the pressure it generates, and vice versa, which is known as the Bernoulli's principle. You got a barometer. A barometer is what measures the pressure. Notice that faster the fluid moves, the lower the pressure is in. Slower moving fluid generates more pressure. Faster moving fluid generates less pressure. All right, so when the pipe widens, the pressure goes up. The steady narrow pipe reaches a point where the pipe widens. So what happens? The water pressure decreases. Not true. It's going to increase. The speed of the water increases. That's not true. It's not going to increase. Speed of the water decreases. So C is the best answer. So C is the best answer. Yeah, Michael, you're the only person who's going to give yourself 5 points for that one. All right, so let's just go back one more time. All right, so faster the fluid moves, the smaller the pressure is, right? When you take the fluid, squeeze it into a small opening, it's going to speed up. When it speeds up, its pressure is going to go down. All right, so it's the Bernoulli's principle, which means that the faster moving fluid is going to generate a lower pressure. So P2 is going to be larger than, P2 is going to be smaller than P1. So a faster moving fluid is going to generate a smaller pressure. So faster the fluid moves, the smaller the pressure is. And if you squeeze the fluid into a small opening, it's going to speed up because of the constancy of the mass flow. Right, so that's how it works.
The weight is minimal and a large surface allows it to rise the highest.
All right, so this is a creative project done by some art students. So a stream of air from a hairdryer, and then what happens is the balloon becomes captured, right? So the question is why? The reason is because within the airstream, the pressure is actually smaller than the surrounding air pressure. So the faster moving air within the stream is going to generate a smaller pressure than the surrounding air pressure. As a result, the balloon is going to be pushed into the stream. It's going to remain inside the stream. So the faster moving air is going to generate a smaller air pressure within the stream. So the air pressure is going to be smaller than the surrounding air pressure. As a result, the balloon will become suspended. All right. Okay. So yeah. All right. So the air pressure within the stream is going to be smaller than the surrounding air pressure. So B is the best answer. So say yes, we got B. Give yourself 5 points.
Now I'd like everybody to take one of these pieces of paper and hold it in front of them like this. Now blow across the top of it like this.
And I'm not the only one with bad breath in here, I'll tell you that right now. Woo! You see, the paper goes up. The strips of paper go up because the moving air is reducing the pressure along the top surface, but not the bottom, so the paper is lifting.
Okay, this one is interesting.
I'd like everybody to take one of these pieces.
All right, so you can lift the paper by blowing air above it, right? Parallel to it in essence, because the faster moving air is going to create a lower pressure above the paper. So the pressure difference is going to lift the paper. All right, so this is known as an airfoil test. It's got the shape of an airplane wing. So it's designed just so that the air is forced to travel faster above the wing. So the faster moving air above is going to create a lower pressure. So which means that there's going to be a pressure difference between top and the bottom of the wing. So on top, the pressure is going to be lower. At the bottom, it's going to be higher. So the pressure difference is what generates the lift.
What you do need is to have the top half of the wing curved, like this. Now, Ms. Krempel, turn the fan on, please. You see, the air going across the wing has to travel farther over the top of the wing because of the curve, so it goes faster to keep up with the rest of the air.
And as it goes faster, it wipes away air pressure from the top of the wing, and so the pressure from beneath the wing forces it up. Right, Professor?
Whoa! Yep, that's right. A wing tilted up or down can help, but as we just saw, it's the curve of a wing that is what really keeps it flying. It's the air blowing over the curve of the wing that causes lift. Now look at a jet plane. The wings are level, but the top part of the wing is curved.
But what about the wind? I thought the wind pushed the plane into the air from behind.
Oh no, Mr. Savage. In fact, the opposite is true. Planes always take off into the wind. That's to ensure that lots of wind will sweep over the wings and create lift.
Thank you, Professor.
You know, the same effect is true for water.
Planes don't fly underwater.
No, but fish do, sort of. Their fins are like wings, with water moving over them instead of air. There are other animals that have figured this out, like a prairie dog, for instance.
I love prairie dogs!
They build up the entrances to their tunnels like little volcanoes. This forces the air to travel faster over the opening, which reduces the pressure and provides ventilation into their homes. What you do need is to have the top...
All right, so once again, by design, the air is forced to go faster above the wing. So faster moving air on top is going to create a lower pressure. So there's going to be a pressure difference between the top and bottom, and the pressure difference is what generates the lift. All right, very good. This is Bernoulli's principle, right? So the faster moving fluid is going to generate a smaller pressure. Okay, very good. So the velocity of the air is going to be larger over the wing, so that the pressure is going to be smaller. All right, very good. He's the best answer. So for every single correct answer, give yourself 5 points.
Is it possible ancient cultures experienced real flight hundreds of years ago? I have some strange objects here, found in pre-Columbian tombs, dated about 800 to 600 before Christ. Archaeologists believe that these must be insects. Perhaps a part of a pre-Inca cult which revered insects. But when closely examined, these figures don't look like insects at all. Insects have their wings on the top of their bodies. Here the wings are on the bottom. So what are these strange figures if they are not insects?
They look like airplanes. The amulets look like airplanes.
Bob Trelease is an expert in the study of early flight.
They have the shape, the physical structure. They have the elements that make an airplane as we recognize it today.
These ancient figures reminded Bob Trelease of a very specific plane.
When I saw the amulet, I immediately associated with the shape of the F-14. The shape matched it.
The apparent resemblance between the modern combat jet and the ancient icon is striking. But could it just be a coincidence? When Bob Trelease noticed something else peculiar about the golden figures, he began to wonder what the reality was behind this mystery.
The curlicues looked like they could be a engineering representation of turbulent air over the leading edge of the wing.
Were our ancestors experimenting with real flights, or perhaps were they expressing some kind of mythology? Could it be both? One possible answer comes from anthropological discoveries made in the 20th century.
When one culture with a simple technology comes into contact with a second culture with a more complex technology, people often turn to religion.
Anthropologist Dr. Lamont Lindstrom offers one explanation for the existence of these figurines. It may be found in the anthropological concept known as cargo cult.
Cargo cult is a South Pacific example of a kind of religious movement that's happened almost every place in the world.
Life in the South Pacific prior to World War II was pre-industrial in its simplicity. There was no electricity. There were no roads and no radio. No contact with the outside world. Overnight, World War II brought amazing treasures from distant worlds to these remote islands. Airplanes descended from the sky and opened their doors. Out flowed a deluge of military equipment and technology, which the islanders had never seen before. To them, the radio was a wonder, a magical machine able to speak in many voices.
So people who had lived a very simple life for generations over a very short period of time experienced an incredible amount of new technology that just poured across the shore and came into their lives.
And then when the war ended, the cargo suddenly disappeared. Desperate to find some way to bring the cargo back, the islanders turned to prayer and religious ritual.
Much of the ritual of cargo cult attempts to attract the return of whoever controls the cargo. They did things like, in many islands, cut airstrips in the forest, in the jungles, hoping that the planes will land again. They built model planes. Sometimes these are small models, sometimes almost life-size models, and put these planes on the airfield as a kind of imitation, some device that will encourage the cargo planes to land.
Using the cargo cult theory, were these gold artifacts created by ancient Indians, modeled after mysterious aircraft from long ago? One way to examine this mystery was to see if the amulets were aerodynamically sound and might have been able to fly. Captain Peter Belding, a pilot and air traffic controller, built exact scale models of these icons out of molded plastic. Although it is unknown whether the amulets might represent powered aircraft or gliders, Captain Belding made them self-propelling. He attached a small prop motor to one, and in the other, he placed a turboprop engine. Now Captain Belding tests the more powerful turboprop model. The sight of these models in the sky raises intriguing questions about the icons on which they are based. The idea that they were copied from a working airplane in existence 800 years before the birth of Christ is very difficult to believe.
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack here. I love this one because this is a good conceptual exercise. So
is it possible ancient cultures experienced real flight hundreds of years ago? I have some strange object here found in pre-Columbian tombs, dated about 800 to 600 before Christ.
Shoot. This guy's name is Eric von Daniken, and he's been writing books ever since the 1970s and 1980s, coming up with these alternative theories, the concepts regarding how space aliens influenced the civilization here on Earth. So he's looking at all these archaeological findings, and he's seeing things and making arguments forever and ever and ever. So I think the History Channel have a bunch of episodes regarding ancient aliens. It's based on this guy's theories usually. That you end up coming up with. All right, so they came up with this explanation. So you got these gold amulets that could be traced back to pre-Inca. So that's 600 to 800 before Christ that you're looking at. So it's almost 3,000 years old, more or less. So the premise is these are based upon designs of airplanes that they were using at the time. So they come up with these anthropological arguments, isn't that? It's quite well put together. So he's driving the point that these are not insects because the insects would not fly like the way the airplanes would. And then sure enough, they make airplane models using the amulets, and then the airplanes, the model airplanes fly just fine. Okay, so maybe just make a few arguments in their favor, in Daniken's favor regarding this. The design that you're looking at is an airplane design that the Wright brothers came up with. Obviously, they had flown their first airplane in 1903. And then, so that we expanded upon that design. And the current airplane designs are based upon the original design that we've been perfecting for the past 120 years or so. All right. So this is not a design that you will come up with overnight. Okay. This is one of the most efficient flying designs for an airplane. As it so happens, these amulets have the proper flight characteristics that the insects would not have. As a result, this thing is flying just fine. All right, so they have two models, and both of them they successfully flew. So, which means that these are amulets more than likely based upon airplane models or some that could fly. All right, so that's the point that he's trying to make. Eric von Daniken. So this is an interesting theory that he's proposing. So, which means that the Incas must have had either airplanes that they could fly, or there were space alien civilizations that were visiting these ancients, and they were flying these airplanes at the time. So either way, the argument is there, and that's the argument that he's trying to justify. Okay, so if you're a believer, you will believe in this sort of stuff. My dad is a huge believer. He's a big fan of Daniken, and obviously History Channel had the pulse of the United States because the ancient alien stuff had been on History Channel forever. And the people who are easily believing this sort of stuff are also pretty easily become QAnon members. Okay, if you believe in these kind of conspiracy theories, if you're that open-minded, then of course you're going to believe in just about anything and everything. So if you're a believer, this is convincing enough. If you're a skeptic, not so much. Okay, so let's take a look at it from the skeptic's perspective. If you're extremely skeptical, you will say, how do we know that the gold amulets can be traced back to pre-Incas? Right? So you're thinking, we could do carbon dating. I'm thinking, no, you cannot do carbon dating. Carbon dating is something that you could do on living things. All right. This gold was never alive at any point in its history, so it's not a living thing, so we cannot do a carbon dating. Only way you can trace it back is if it's an archaeological evidence, and if it's obviously the evidence, if it fits in with the Inca style amulets or the artworks or whatever, and then obviously you have to go with the experts on that one. If it's proven to be pre-Inca, then it's proven to be pre-Inca. The next thing that you need to do is figure out if it's not an airplane, what could it be? What could fly in this fashion? It's not going to be, it could be a bird, obviously, some kind of bird design, or it could be fish, because the fish, in essence, they also fly, they fly in water, right, inside water. All right, so evidently there's enough of archaeological findings that there were fish that had the same sort of shape, swimming in rivers back then. All right, so you can make that argument as well. So at this point, it's not science. It's, if you're a skeptic, you will argue one way. If you're a believer, you will argue the other way. So it's up to you. All right, it could be, like the demo says, it could be aliens. I don't know. If you're comfortable with it, you're comfortable with it. If you're not, you're not. To me, what was interesting is how this Eric von Daniken takes all these ideas and puts them together in a convincing sort of way so that you can actually make an argument around it. So, I'll go with the fish argument, but that doesn't mean that there are no aliens. That doesn't mean that we're not being visited. So who knows what happens. All right, so speaking of the airplanes, the stuff that I'm going to focus on is, boom, the animation that's not flying. The animation that's not flying. So let's move on to the next one. All right, so the inside the airplane will get slammed against the ceiling. Why? Because the airplane is falling faster than the passengers inside. The question is why? The reason why the airplane falls faster than passengers inside is because of the Bernoulli's principle. All right, so the airplanes are designed to become part of the air mass that they're flying in. So if the air mass goes up, it's going to take the airplane with it. If the air mass goes down, once again, it's going to take the airplane with it. You're going to find these kind of turbulence events usually around obstacles like the mountains, because when the air is forced to go through or around obstacles, it speeds up. It's exactly the same thing that happens whenever you force the water to go through a smaller opening, it speeds up. So the air mass underneath will have to negotiate through these obstacles. As a result, air mass underneath, below, is actually moving faster than the mass above. Faster moving air underneath or below is going to create a lower pressure. So the lower pressure of this air mass is going to pull the air mass above it in the downward direction at a larger rate. All right, so next time when you're going to California or whatever, obviously you will have to go above the mountains. Immediately you will feel the buffeting. I mean, you're 30,000 feet up, but the air mass down below is so well disturbed that even 30,000 feet up, you will feel the buffeting. The airplane does that, so it goes up and down. Because the air below it's forced to go through all these obstacles. So because it's moving through the obstacles, it speeds up. Speeding air is going to create a lower pressure. So which means that that lower pressure air below, air mass below, is going to pull the air mass above it in the downward direction. So that's the reason why. Let's talk about the race car.
As strange as it may seem, a machine such as this is not so much a car, but an airplane flying upside down, very, very close to the ground.
The simplest aerodynamic device is a wing. On an aeroplane, the wing's mounted this way round, and the air has to go further around the top surface than the bottom surface, so the air going over the top has to go faster than the air going underneath. Faster air has a lower pressure, so it produces lift.
Daniel Bernoulli, a Dutch mathematician, established in the 18th century that the faster air travels, the lower its pressure. This is the fundamental principle behind both how airplanes fly and how Formula One cars stay on the track.
On a racing car, we take the wing and put it the other way up, so it produces a force in the downward direction, downforce.
Downforce is the holy grail for modern race car designers. It pushes the cars into the track, increasing their grip by as much as a factor of 4.
While a car's going around a corner, it tries to go straight on. This is a natural law of physics, and the only force you have to prevent the car flying off the road is the grip provided by the tyres.
With all things being equal, a car with 4 times its own weight in downforce will be able to corner 4 times faster than one with no downforce at all. As strange as it may seem, a machine...
Actually, they had a really good explanation for this. I love the explanation. It was complete, it was concise, it was done beautifully. All right, so the race cars can negotiate these curves 4 times faster than regular cars without going into scale. Part of the reason is because they're able to generate a downforce, which is 4 times the weight of these vehicles. So the question is how. There are 2 reasons for it. He actually talked about one of them. One of them is the design of the shape of the wing over here. This is an upside down airplane wing. Okay, so which means that the air is forced to go faster underneath. So the faster moving air underneath is going to create a lower pressure, right? So the air pressure above is going to be larger than the air pressure lower. So there's going to be a huge pressure difference between the top and the bottom. So it generates 4 times the downforce. It's 4 times larger than the weight of the vehicle. So the downforce is going to be 4 times larger than the weight of the vehicle. So 4 times the downforce, 4 times the frictional force. So the amount of friction that it experiences is 4 times larger than a regular commercial car. That's one explanation for it. There's a second thing that they do is the space underneath is important. So number one, this is an inverted or upside down airplane wing, shape-wise. So the air is forced to go faster underneath, but also they keep the space as small as possible. So when you force the air into a smaller opening, it's going to speed up further, right? That's the constancy of the mass flow rate. So they try to make this gap as small as possible. Smaller the gap is, faster the air is going to move, the slower the pressure is going to be underneath. All right, so it's a beautiful design.
The cruel irony is that in the relentless search for cornering performance through aerodynamics, the cars had become dangerously unstable.
With the regulations that were in practice at the time of Ben's crash, the car had to run very, very close to the ground. And we're talking here about this far above the ground. We're not talking about road car type figures of inches, we're talking about millimeters.
The reason that this distance, called the ride height, was so slim was due once again to the basic physical principle that fast air creates low pressure.
The designer tries to get maximum possible velocity of air underneath the car because that way he generates a low pressure and sucks the car to the ground.
The faster the air can be made to travel under the car, the lower its pressure, just as the Bernoulli principle dictates. Because the way to get the air to travel very fast is to minimize the ride height. The smaller the gap, the faster the air has to travel to squeeze through. A very low car means very high downforce.
The problem comes as the car gets lower and lower and lower, the velocity gets higher and higher, you get more and more downforce. Eventually, if it touches the ground, the airflow stops, you get a sudden loss of downforce, sudden loss of grip, which gives the driver a big problem in the middle of the corner.
The cruel irony is that in the relentless search for cornering...
It's beautifully explained. All right, so they try to make the ride height space in front of the car. All right, so we're talking about this space right here. All right, they try to make that gap as small as possible. Smaller the gap is, the faster the air is going to move. Smaller the pressure is, the larger the pressure difference is, the larger the downforce is, the larger the grip, larger the frictional force becomes. So that's what the problem is. Except they decided to lower the ride height, and they tried to make it as small as possible in order to increase the grip, the frictional force. And at some point, if it touches the ground, if this section touches the ground, obviously, all of a sudden, there's no gap there, and there's no air coming through, and all of a sudden you end up losing all that downforce. The only thing you have to rely on is the weight of the car, except for the car to be able to negotiate these curves, the car needs to have that downforce, the normal force. If it doesn't have that downforce, it's moving about 4 times faster than it should be, so you're going to end up losing control of the car. So which means that static friction is going to become kinetic, which means that the car is going to start to slide. And that's what happened to Senna.
11.0 seconds into Senna's 7th, something had reduced the ride height of the Williams FW16. Television viewers saw an explosion of sparks, indicating that the car was definitely touching the ground in the middle of one of the fastest corners in all of Formula One. What was it that caused Senna's car to scrape along the ground that day in 1994?
In the case of Senna's accident, there was a bad incident at the start. So it was decided to start the race behind the safety car. Now the safety car is just a road car driven at reasonable speed, but way below anything that a racing car would ever do.
The race at Imola was only the second time a safety car had been used on a dry track in Formula One, and it played havoc with the cars following behind it. The tires cooled down from their normal hot racing temperatures, causing them to contract, and it was this that caused the drop in the extremely critical ride height.
It wouldn't normally be just skating, just touching the ground in those places, on those bumps. Well, of course, with the tyre pressures down by maybe 25%, the movement in the tyre was maybe up by 4 or 5 millimeters. And when the skid, which is metallic, hits the ground, rather than having a huge grip that sticky racing rubber has, and is being pointed in the correct direction by the driver, you have it's just like a ski.
So not only had a large amount of downforce been removed from the car by denying the airflow underneath it, the car was also resting, for this split second only, on the metal skids beneath it. The car was suddenly unable to generate the grip it needed to make the corner. 2 seconds, the back of the car stepped out. Ayrton Senna steered into the slide with the lightning reactions of a triple world champion. 1/10 of a second later, the front of the car gripped, and turned it to the right. The data logger recorded that the brakes were fully on. The car was now slowing down as hard as possible, but Ayrton Senna ran out of road.
When all's said and done, the really tragic thing about Ayrton's crash was that if it wasn't for one little thing, he would have been able to jump out of the car and walk back to his spare for the restart. And that little thing was that when his car hit the wall, the front wheel was trapped between the wall and the chassis as the suspension collapsed. And as the car skidded along the wall, the wheel trapped between the two just popped up at the wrong moment and hit him in the head. If it wasn't for that, he would have been uninjured.
Just over 4 hours later, Senna died in the hospital. On his return to his native Brazil, he was given a burial in keeping with his status as a national hero. Millions of fans flocked to pay their respects, and his country declared 3 days of official mourning. The lessons learned from his accident have changed the sport forever, and without a doubt have saved many lives since.
That was unfortunate.
Wednesday, Andretti going over 200 miles an hour. When he hit debris on the track, he walked away from this wreckage, but did...
All right, so race cars, like upside down airplane wings by design. So the air is supposed to go faster underneath. And there was a debris on the road, obviously. So what happened, the air got under the vehicle, and then it becomes like sails at this point. So what happened, it just pushes up against the exposed area underneath and just pushes it in the backward direction, so it lifts it up. And then all of a sudden, when it starts to lift up just like that, now what's happening is the air above is moving faster than the air down below. And then it generates additional lift. And so that's what happened to this guy. It just bumped up just a little bit, and then it caught the air, and faster moving air under the circumstances. Now it looks like an airplane wind. So the air is moving faster above right now, so it generates an additional lift.
Shelley's had her share of close calls and near misses. One of them was at a race in Minnesota. She had
same thing's going to happen to her.
Just come off a good series of runs. It was one of those days when everything seemed to be going smoothly.
We were racing in Brainerd, Minnesota, and the car at about, I have to think now, about 400 feet out started to smoke the tires, and she pedaled it real fast. Well, when she lifted, the clutch finished locking up, and as she floated, it hooked up, and the car went right over backwards. And it was like she didn't have a chance.
I remember when it went up, what I said, tuck your thumbs. Because when it rolls, I drive like this. It'll take my thumbs off. So I did. I said, tuck my thumbs, and I just put it on the bottom of the steering wheel. And it hit the first time, and I went, oh, not bad. That was stupid, because when it hit the second time, then it hurt.
Well, when Shelley had the blowover, I didn't know it, but at that time she had separated some ribs. And because the next day when I was strapping her in a car and I would pull the seatbelts tight, I seen her winching a little bit. And I said, "No problem? Nope, I'm fine." And it wasn't until about a week later I found out after she got home, she went to a doctor and she had separated ribs and stuff. So she's pretty tough.
The blowover was caused when Shelley's car lost power. Normally, the tremendous engine thrust keeps the nose of the dragster pinned to the ground. But when the engine burns out, or in Shelley's case misfires, the resulting loss of downward air pressure on the nose causes the front of the car to rise, producing a backwards catapult, or blowover. Shelley's had her share of close calls and near misses.
Let's take a look at that. That's kind of weird. All right, so let's take a look at the shape first. All right, once again, take a look at the space underneath. And it's an inverted airplane wing design that you got. So that the air is forced to go faster underneath, so it's supposed to pin it down. All right, so air is moving faster underneath, so the gap is there by design. On top of that, they keep the gap as small as possible, so you force the air into a small opening. And now, for whatever the reason, they're talking about losing power. I don't know exactly why that happened, but all of a sudden, the air was going faster on top. If it starts to the left, the air is going to start moving faster. Even if there's something on the road, if you bounce just like that, all of a sudden, the shape is different. The shape is almost like an airplane shape under the circumstances. So what that means is that the air above is going to go faster. It's just going to generate a lift. And then I think that's what happened. I'm looking at, I don't know exactly why, all of a sudden, boom, it just bounced up. They got an explanation for it, but I'm not convinced how accurate that explanation is. All right, so the faster moving air outside.
Just as important as careful design is proper maintenance of aircraft. Take the Aloha Airlines 737 descending for a landing at Honolulu in April of 1988. Suddenly, 18 feet of the top of the plane simply tore off. A flight attendant who was not in her seat was sucked out into the sky. But after an emergency landing, no other lives were lost.
Design flaw and a maintenance disaster. Obviously a design flaw, and what is really sad is other operators in the manufacturer had figured that out. There were actually kits available to go back and retrofit and check for those things.
The problem turned out to be simple metal fatigue associated with the use of aluminum, which is unlike steel in one crucial respect: fatigue life.
Aluminum does not have an infinite fatigue life. If I took a bar that it took 10,000 pounds to break and I started pulling on it at 2,000 pounds, after a while it would go snap, and I would have two pieces.
Every time an aluminum passenger jet reaches altitude, it is pressurized inside like a balloon. When it descends, the pressure is released. If this process continues indefinitely without maintenance, sooner or later the balloon bursts. In airplanes, it becomes a concern around 30,000 to 50,000 takeoff and landing cycles. The first thing that happens is that cracks form in the skin.
There were a couple people who actually saw the crack before they boarded, and they just assumed, and I also assumed, that we could just trust that somebody had seen that and the government was doing its job.
All right, so something like this happened a couple of years ago. The airplane window just popped open, and the person sitting next to the window got partially ejected from the airplane, and they were able to hold on to her for a while. Eventually, she had a heart attack and died while they were holding on to her. All right, so what's happening is if a portion of the airplane goes missing, if you're not buckled down, you'll get sucked out. The reason is because of the pressure difference between inside and outside. Obviously, the inside is pressurized, but that's not the reason why. The main reason is because the airplane is moving at like 450 miles or 550 miles per hour while it's flying in full flight 30,000 feet up, which means that the air relative to the airplane is moving at 550 miles per hour. So the faster moving air outside is going to generate a relatively low pressure. So there's going to be a pressure difference between inside and outside of the airplane. And in large part, that air pressure difference, the pressure difference in air pressure is going to be due to the fact that the air outside is moving at extremely high speeds. Nuclear explosion. A lot of people mistakenly think that what kills is the radiation.
One consequence of the Cold War is we actually detonated several large nuclear weapons, and this allowed us to study how air blast waves travel across the surface of the Earth.
It's a well-designed bomb. The bomb should not be killing the target population because of radiation. If you're trying to kill the target population through radiation, that's known as a dirty bomb. It's not the best way to kill people. It's not the efficient way of killing people. It's extremely inhumane way of killing people. You don't want to kill people through radiation. That's a horrible way of killing people. All right, because you're not avenging something. If it's a war situation, obviously you want the war to be done with. And the whole idea is if you're trying to make a point, just kill people without causing any pain or undue suffering, if you have to, if you must. All right, and the nuclear bombs are designed to kill through blast waves. All right. What happens is upon exploding, it creates a shock wave. And this shock wave is going to travel roughly about 1,000 miles per hour. It's faster than sound, so it's going to push the air out of its way. So it creates a partial vacuum. So if you're exposed to the shock wave, literally, it's almost like being exposed to the full vacuum of space. That's something that we studied last week. So what happens when you're exposed to the full vacuum of space? you end up experiencing bends, right? The extreme bends. It's going to suck the air out of your body. You should lose consciousness immediately. You shouldn't feel a thing after that point. So that's what happens. So the faster moving air is going to create an extremely low pressure. It's almost like the pressure is almost like the pressure of deep space or empty space, more like it. The buildings will explode because the outside pressure is going to be nearly zero, as the inside pressure is nearly 1 atmospheric pressure, about 15 pounds per
Followed by hurricane
So because of the pressure difference, they're going to
travel for tens of miles. For tens of miles.
All right, so the same thing happens during tornadoes and hurricanes. So the faster moving air outside is going to create a lower pressure. So there's going to be a pressure difference between inside and outside of the building. As a result, you may end up losing the roof. In this case, the side of the building is gone, and sometimes the buildings completely explode, depending upon how fast the air is moving outside.
Downstream, and even roll it up.
Years ago, there was a tsunami. Quite a few people died as a result. Even if you are an Olympic, next to impossible to swim in flood water. And while debris swim in flood waters because of the strong undercurrent. All right, so the stronger the pressure difference is going to suck undercurrent. All right, so there are a number of reasons for it. The first one is fairly obvious for this one.
The stranded motorists are bailing out, but before they can act, a man tries wading to their rescue. He struggles to reach the car, but the torrent overcomes his heroic effort to help, and soon he can't even help himself. The car, where he's in danger of being crushed by the shifting vehicle or drowned. It's a heart-stopping moment, but suddenly he bobs up downstream. Certainly would have perished. Amazingly, he's still conscious as he surfaces. Everyone else wisely waits for the truck.
The computer is acting up. That's the reason why I had to stop. All right, so the current in this direction is extremely strong. All right, let me check to see where we are. All right, so this is good. This is working fine. All right. The reason why it's extremely strong because of the obstacle in this direction. All right, so if you put a car there, when you force the water to go through an opening, which is extremely small, the water is going to speed up. So which means that there is a stronger current within this region just before the obstacle that you're looking at. So he just steps into that strong undercurrent or strong current in general, loses his balance immediately. You step in like that. This guy's lucky that the water is not deep enough, and it's almost knee deep. It's less than knee deep, so he's able to keep his head above it. And then he gets closer to that gap under the car. Obviously, the gap under the car is generating a tremendous amount of pressure difference. All right, so there's a very strong undercurrent there, and the closer you get to it, the stronger the undercurrent is going to be, the larger the pressure difference is. So he gets stuck right under the car. Right? I mean, he hits the side of it, and it's just going to get pulled right under the vehicle. Lucky for him, it's not a heavy enough vehicle. It's stuck right under the car, obviously. And then the car gets pushed up because it's not that heavy. And then he emerges on the other side. So he did survive. Something this easy, something this simple could have been deadly. Right? It seems like it's a harmless flooding, but the water, the fluid around the obstacles, through the obstacles, the smaller the gaps between the obstacles, the faster it's going to move. So which means that the stronger the undercurrent is going to be. Stronger the undercurrent is, the bigger the pressure is, so you'll get sucked under. And that
River is home to one of the most treacherous canoe races in the world. Fast, furious, and unforgiving. These turbulent rapids are a swirling death trap, so dangerous that they claimed the life of one young competitor earlier in the day. Most racers are so fearful of this hazardous stretch of water that they incur extra time by getting out and carrying their canoes to avoid the danger. But 23-year-old Lachlan Mills tries to save a couple of minutes by barreling through the rough rapids. There he is, wearing the helmet. Suddenly, his fight for first place becomes a fight for his life. The force of the current flips Lachlan and wedges him between two jagged rocks. Spectators along the shore watch in horror as Lachlan is dragged beneath the surface. Rescue diver Tim Ward knows he has to act fast.
The only chance he's got of getting out was me, because there was nothing else going to get him out.
Tim jumps in, but he can't move. The powerful rapids are holding him back.
It's so unbelievable. There was nothing we could do.
Lachlan's life is slipping away. Tim summons the strength to battle the brutal current, finally reaching the canoe.
I get to the bow and I start to lift, and it didn't budge. It just didn't budge at all.
Lachlan has now been underwater for more than a minute and a half. Tim has no idea whether he's alive or dead, but he's not about to give up.
There'd been a clock ticking in the back of my mind. I knew that it was all a matter of timing. If something didn't get done very soon, we'd be pulling out a body.
Just when all hope seems lost, Lachlan gets a lucky break. An out-of-control racer bumps into his canoe, freeing it from the rocks. Tim pulls Lachlan's head above the water, but it's not breathing. Quickly, Tim and his fellow rescuers begin mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. They pull Lachlan to safety, praying that it's not too late.
Call it fate or whatever, but I don't think Lachlan's time was up.
After what seems like an eternity, Lachlan regains consciousness. He recalls what went wrong.
shortly after I went over the edge, that's when I started to lose control over the boat. That was where my heart was in my mouth, because that was the point of no return. White words everywhere. The realization was coming to me that, yeah, I could quite easily drown. I could quite easily drown here at age 23.
Thanks to the courage of rescue diver Tim Moore, Lachlan survives. But he will never again underestimate this river's awesome power. Vertical straight.
Okay, so the problem usually happens when you have obstacles in the water. Around the obstacles, the water is going to speed up. When it starts to speed up, it creates all these currents. And obviously, you got rocks all over the place. And when you actually start to go towards the riverbed, the spacing between the rocks will start to diminish. It becomes smaller and smaller, which means that as you start to go deeper, the water is going to go faster. So, which means that there's always going to be a very strong undercurrent right there. So that's the reason why a lot of the people are just not interested in canoeing over this section, because it's really, really dangerous. Take a look at the water level. The water level is not that deep. This is knee-deep waters, and these guys are just standing there, I think, for whatever reason. And if you go under, right at that point, there's going to be an extremely strong undercurrent. So that's what happened to this guy. So there's a strong undercurrent. As a result, the canoe just tips over. This guy's upside down. And that portion is not really deep. Look at this guy. Look, it's literally knee-deep right there. And this guy is upside down. And then the pressure difference is so great that this guy is not able to right the canoe up. And then the guy gets lucky. The other canoer comes in and hits him, and then it just turns the canoe over. And somehow, magically, this guy is still alive. All right, so things worked out. All right, so pick out the best answer. Okay, very good. Steve's the best answer you guys got. There's us 5 points for that one. All right, so smoke is going to get drawn to the open window, right? Because the faster moving air outside, it's going to create a lower pressure. So there's going to be a pressure difference between inside and outside. So the air is going to get sucked from the open window. So C is the best answer.